Now, who implements the inflation targeting policy framework? The implementation of inflation targeting is done by the South African Reserve Bank. It's done by the South African Reserve Bank, emphasis, independently of the government. So the government sets the inflation targeting policy framework, but it is implemented independently by the South African Reserve Bank. Let me go into detail in terms of the role of the South African Reserve Bank. So their mandate, the South African Reserve Bank, is to achieve and maintain price stability. And they have to do that in the interest of what we call balanced and sustainable economic growth in South Africa. But the Reserve Bank is also independent. So the South African Constitution prescribes that the South African Reserve Bank must be independent. In addition, we've also got the South African Reserve Bank Act, and that also enshrines the Reserve Bank's independence from the political principles, from the politicians. Why do we insist on the Reserve Bank being independent of the politicians, especially insofar as monetary policy and the implementation of inflation targeting is concerned? Why? Let me give you a simplistic example. In the past, when the central bank wasn't independent, and this was in South Africa and in other parts of the world, what would happen is the politicians would manipulate the interest rate for their own political purposes to the detriment of the overall economy. So imagine Mr. Mack is president and there's an election coming up in a year's time and he's thinking, I might lose that election. In the past, what would happen is he'd go to the governor of the Reserve Bank, where the Reserve Bank wasn't independent, and he would say, drop interest rates. And the governor would have to listen. The governor would drop interest rates. People would start being able to afford new cars, bigger houses, etc. The economy would be bubbling. So come the election, people who were previously unhappy with Mr. Mack as president would say, we'll vote for him anyway. Or we just wouldn't bother to vote. And Mr. Mack would be elected president again. Shortly after the election, inflation would have started getting out of control. Mr. Mack, as the newly elected president, would go back to the governor of the Reserve Bank and say, listen, you need to increase interest rates again to get inflation under control. The governor would do that. But you're now stuck with Mr. Mack as president for the next 5 years. So in the past, politicians all over the world would manipulate the central bank or the Reserve Bank for their own political ends, but to the detriment of the economy. And what most progressive democracies have done now is enshrine the independence of the Reserve Bank or the central bank to protect it from political interference in the setting of monetary policy and interest rates.